try to encourage families through generous welfare benefits, but simply cut availability of any method of contraception. And it resulted in a wave of secret abortions. Of course, people were rebelling against being manipulated that way. And a tragedy of a lot of women dying as a result of infections of abortions performed in back streets. And a real tragedy of high female mortality rates. So when I think about these efforts to introduce policies, I can see the history of Europe being littered with often perverse and unintended consequences of trying to come up, one, with a policy that is good for all, and this is just one way of doing things, and secondly, the policy that thinks about family and family planning mostly in terms of limiting the number of children. And that implies sort of lack of openness to having children. So I think these two aspects strike me as something that I can think about the lessons for balancing work and family, that we should be open, generous, cultivate the attitude of generosity, of openness to having children, and that we shouldn't be dogmatic about any one way of doing it. It should take place by considering in the family the best interests of everybody, every family member. Of course, best interest of children, because they cannot articulate their interests, and every child is different, so it's something that requires a lot of attention. But I think if there is a lesson that I could draw, and based on my study of Eastern Europe, I would caution against drawing too strict lessons. And it would be really the lesson of flexibility. Mm-hmm. And families can be flexible in different ways, and families can be very creative about how they strike the right balance when they have children. And I think it's perhaps this legacy of thinking in the 20th century. I mean, it's not just Eastern Europe, but in Western Europe as well. There was demographic transition to very low birth rates, to thinking about, worrying about having children and worrying what will happen when I have them. And, you look then at countries like Germany, all Western European countries now suffering from very low birth rates because, it's a perverse result of some of these policies. And my personal story is also that, the balance was anything but planning. When my first child was born, I worked full-time, then I worked part-time, then I stopped altogether when my third child was born. Now I'm sort of going back slowly to where I was 13 years ago when my first child was born, and none of that was planned. In fact, it was all, you do what you have to do. And be creative and flexible. And I'm sure that now every member of the panel will say a similar but a different story of how they strike the balance. And I think it's the diversity, the allowing people, allowing families to develop that generosity of spirit, attitude of patience, attitude of consideration for everybody's needs.
I appreciate that, and I want to share some personal thoughts. Actually, you've got me thinking about lots of different things now based on what you shared, but I'll share what I was planning on sharing. Just three things that came to mind as I was reflecting upon this in the last few days. And I think the first is I just feel a need to express a sense of gratitude that we can have this discussion at all. I get to wear a number of different hats. I get to be a mother and a wife, and my current role campus minister here at Princeton. And so I have the privilege of trying to figure out how to juggle those three things. And I'm aware that there are lots of women and lots of people in the world who don't get that privilege of juggling those things, who would like to be married and aren't, who would like to have children and can't, who would love to have a job that they find fulfilling and don't. Most of us here, we're discussing lifestyle choices we have made, choosing from a myriad of options. And just realizing that many people in the world don't get to do that. And so remembering that keeps me from complaining about how hard it is to juggle these things sometimes, and remembering that it's a luxury that I get to balance them at all. And the second thing that I've been thinking of goes along a lot with what you were sharing, is that I'm glad to be here and share my viewpoints and experiences, but I don't feel like an expert. There are days in which I feel like I'm not doing this balancing thing very well at all. And I'm very cautious about claiming that there's a right way to do it. I think there are probably some wrong ways, or some harmful ways, or some unhealthy ways, but I think there are a lot of right ways, a lot of ways that work, a lot of ways that are acceptable. And it's funny for me to say that because, I mean, I do believe actually in absolute truth and in certain absolute morality, but I don't think that the categories of good and bad or right and wrong can necessarily be applied to the things we're discussing right now. And I think especially as women, we tend to easily judge each other and judge the decisions that we make. I mean, I found myself doing it. How could she leave her kids for that long to go on a business trip? Or, you know, I can't believe she's having yet another child and giving up that career. I mean, we make these sort of judgments, at least in our heads. And so I guess I caution myself and all of us as you said, to be generous and to allow a lot of flexibility. The decisions I've made in my own life have been based partially on personal convictions, on my convictions, on my husband's convictions about what we want our family to look like, what our family should look like. But they've also been based a lot on personal circumstances. And we often don't know the dozens of factors that go into each person's decision, each family's decision. I spent almost 10 years as a stay-at-home mom, and that is much longer than I would have expected to be a stay-at-home mom, much longer than I would have chosen to be at home. But at the time, we were actually living in Eastern Europe. We were living in a foreign country with no family support, with very few viable career options for me. My husband traveled extensively, sometimes for weeks at a time, and so it seemed the right thing for our family for me to focus primarily on the children, at times exclusively on the children. You know, in different contexts, under different situations, I may have made a very different decision, still based on the same principles. I mean, it's interesting when you were mentioning Eastern Europe. I lived in Hungary for 12 years, post-communism, and seeing the effects of all this communist policy, seeing the low birth rate, and the state then deciding that we need more kids, and instituting policies to encourage people to have children, and almost trying to mandate lots of children, and big families with some of the same skewed results, and some, I think, corrupted then thinking about family. Then the final thing I would say, kind of while I have a little platform here, in regards to the issue of, you know, can you have it all, is that I think I would say no. If having it all means having the family we always dreamed of and having the ultimate in career achievement. And I think this is true for women or for men. I think it is just simply true that a woman or a man who does not have a spouse or children, who does not have these responsibilities, can devote more time, passion, energy, commitment to a career than a person who does have those responsibilities. And to the extent that success is dependent upon that kind of single-minded dedication, I think the person without a family will achieve success faster. And maybe reach different levels, and I think that's okay. I don't regret the time I spent home with my children. I don't regret any sacrifices I've made for my children, but I don't think we do you undergrads in the audience a favor by telling you that there aren't any.